honor to introduce our first keynote speaker for today. It's a joint venture tradition not to give long and lavish introductions at the State of the Valley. You'll find detailed information about the speakers in your program. Instead, we'd like to tell you why we invited Professor Pastor to address us. So let me put it to you this way. Income inequality, the widening gap in Silicon Valley, until we see signs of social unrest, may seem like recent developments, and it's kind of the topic du jour, but they are nothing of the sort to Professor Pastor. Like a prophet, Professor Pastor has actually been writing on these subjects for decades. He is considered among our nation's foremost demographers. He has broken new ground by using quantitative methods to show there is a more inclusive formula for America's major metropolitan regions. This is especially the case in Silicon Valley, he will argue. And in light of what we have just heard from Russ and Emmett, it's clear that Manuel's time has surely come. He's based at the University of Southern California, but I also want you to know that I heard a clap out there, that we still think of Professor Pastor as a Valley guy. He used to teach at UC Santa Cruz, and many of us remember he would spend lots of time here in the Valley, helping people understand why there's a business case for investing in social mobility. We miss having him around, and we're glad he accepted our invitation to come back. Ladies and gentlemen, our morning keynote speaker, Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Thanks. Wow, that is like totally cool. That has never happened before. I'm going to try to arrange that to happen before all my classes in the future. It's really, as was mentioned, I lived in Santa Cruz for a long time, worked with joint venture on a number of civic issues, and so I'm really glad to be back with you. Russ, when he invited me to speak, asked me to try to put into context some of these broader issues of demographic change and economic insecurity and economic inequality. He wanted me to talk about the future of the Valley and the future of the country. He wanted me to talk about whether or not equity and growth were linked. He wanted me to talk about smart growth and the kind of planning that you needed to do to move forward. He mentioned a few other things yesterday. He wanted me to discuss whether or not the new cybersecurity officer for Target would be Edward Snowden. He was wondering whether or not we had a better chance at comprehensive immigration reform now that John Boehner is in the game a little bit, because with his orange skin, many people think he's an alien. And then finally, just on the way up here, I was a little bit surprised about this. He asked whether or not I would comment on what seemed to be a tragedy last year when the Nobel Prize did not go to this young woman who'd done so much to forge intercultural understanding, Miley Cyrus. Because she brought twerking to the world and stuff. And by the way, if you don't get that joke, you're way too old. So that's a lot to do in a short keynote, what we in Spanish call a keynotito. So instead, what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of these issues that have come up today by really talking about the changing demography, the changing economy in the next California. But I think the theme for you to think of, and I think it's the theme really that's being lifted up by Russ's presentation, what Emmett said, and what I think is in the index as well, is the key challenge for the Valley right now is how do you link innovation with inclusion? How do you link this innovation economy with a more inclusive economy? How do you link high tech with high need? That is, how do you take the strength of the Valley and make sure that it's addressing the disparities in terms of income and educational achievement that were being discussed earlier? So that's where I will head in just a little while. Let me begin with the following. For many of you, the happiest day of the year is your birthday, or Christmas, or Rosh Hashanah. For others of you, the happiest day of the year is today, when you get to see all the indicators to let you know about the valley. For me, the happiest day of the year is when the census releases its data. And that's because we find out what happened to the country as a whole. And what we found out with the last census was a lot about demographic change. We found out that the growth rate in the country for Latinos between 2000 and 2010 was 43%. The growth rate for Asian Pacific Islanders, 43%. A remarkable coincidence. I think they were coordinating. The growth rate for African Americans, 11%. The growth rate for non-Hispanic whites, only 1%. That's why on the night of the 2012 election, when commentators on the news were surprised that President Obama won with only 39% of the white vote, people like me were going, where were you when I was giving speeches this last year? Now, when people see those numbers, and particularly the growth rate for Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders, what do they generally think is driving that? Immigration. And that's certainly what the debate's about. But here's what's interesting. Those are the rates, by the way, for California. You note they're a little bit lower, and actually a little bit lower, in fact, for Santa Clara. What is really driving demographic change in the United States right now is no longer immigration. In fact, immigration flows into the country have slowed down, and most demographers believe that migration, net migration from Mexico, our traditional largest sender, is actually zero. That is, there's as many people going back to Mexico as are coming into the country. Why? Because the Mexican economy and much of Latin America is actually doing better economically than it has in the past, but more fundamentally, because the fertility rate in Mexico has changed dramatically. It used to be that over the course of her lifetime 30 years ago, a Mexican woman would have 5 children. Because of a lot of family planning, the fertility rate in Mexico now is 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. So the push factors that we've had in the past are no longer there. That's one of the reasons why comprehensive immigration reform has been queued up in the Senate before going to the Congress, where the House of Representatives, where all good things go to die, and which is what seems to be happening right now. And what we know is that because of this shift in the sort of push factors from both Asia and Latin America, that most demographers are worried about whether or not we're going to have enough immigrant workers in the future to sustain the U.S. economy. So where is the demographic change coming from? Where's the growth coming from? Young people. And this shows you what happened in the U.S. as a whole for young folks, those under the age of 18. So between 2000 and 2010, the number of young whites, non-Hispanic whites in the country, actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, I always like to clarify, that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News, blamed on the president. And don't worry, I'll make fun of Rachel Maddow later. So what it means is that more people are moving into 19 and 20 than are moving into 1 and 2. So the number of young whites fell, the number of young African Americans fell by about 250,000. The number of young Latinos actually grew by 4.8 million, the number of Asian Pacific Islanders by 800,000. So that's the next America, and in fact, it's also pretty much the next California. The interesting thing, these are charts showing you the growth rates for these different numbers of young people, is that in California, there's actually a pretty sharp decline in the number of young whites and young African Americans, but there's a slowing in the growth of Latinos, Asians, and the other category. And that's interesting because really what's going on is that California is kind of coming to the end of a demographic change process, as we'll see in just a second. So what does that mean for the United States as a whole? By about the year 2042, 2043, the US as a whole will be so-called majority minority, or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time. That is, that all of us will be a minority group. By about the year 2031, the majority of the workforce, people actually working, will be people of color. 2019, 2020, majority of young people in the United States will be people of color. Last year was the first year the majority of births were to people of color. So that's where the US as a whole is headed. But what's interesting to note about that is the following numbers. Look that in the year 2000, the share of non-Hispanic whites in the population was about 69%. In 2040, projected to be about 50%. And in 2050, it'll be about 45%. Well, that's basically the change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. In some ways, California is America fast forward. And those were certainly bumpy years in terms of race relations. We had the 1994 Proposition 187, which was an anti-undocumented immigrant, perceived as simply being anti-immigrant measure in the state, struggles around affirmative action, a number of other things. We seem to have come out of it in a much calmer place. But we've been through this before, both in California and certainly in the Silicon Valley. In fact, demographers say that they know the exact day that California became majority minority. And I actually remember it. It was December 15th, 1999, because I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long saying, California's majority minority, it's majority minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? There was a tone of anxiety in their voice. So finally I said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. And how many of you have been salsa dancing? How many of you took that class right before so you wouldn't embarrass yourself, right? So it's about learning a new step. It's about learning a new step of leadership between different groups. It's about learning about what these communities are like. And it's about learning what these patterns are like in terms of economics and educational achievement and what we need to do to be able to address those moving forward. And California will be moving forward. You can see this is California going from 1980 projected up to the year 2040. You can see that by 2030, a little bit after, California will be majority Latino, which means everyone will have to say California the right way. You're lucky because San Jose will always be San Jose. And I'm just the city manager from Fremont. Don't worry, there's no translation for Fremont. Maybe Libremont, but I don't know. So we are going to be experiencing this demographic change. And of course, what's very interesting about Santa Clara County, and we'll get to the overall valley in a second, is that you've been through this before. You got here a lot earlier than the state. And one thing that's particularly interesting that's been driving you is the growth in the Asian population, not simply the Latino population, which is more characteristic of the country as a whole. And then the other really fascinating thing about the Silicon Valley is the following. When people say in California, what part of California is the most immigrant? What people tend to think is that that must be Los Angeles or it must be San Francisco. Here's what's fascinating. The share of the foreign-born has been on the decline in Los Angeles and San Francisco for the last 3 years. And the most immigrant part of the state is the Silicon Valley. And it is the place where the growth is continuing. Asian migration as well as Mexican migration, outpacing the state as a whole and certainly outpacing the nation. And when people think about migration into the Silicon Valley, again, the focus tends to be on Asian migration, skilled engineers, the growing South Asian Indian population, all very important populations. And you can see this a little bit in your data in terms of taking the Silicon Valley or Santa Clara County ethnicity and breaking it up. You can see that for the Latino population, a much larger share is US born. For the API population, a much larger share, that means Asian Pacific Islander, is immigrant. But what's fascinating about, there's a couple things that are fascinating about this. One is that we in California have a much more settled immigrant population. So there's a tendency to think about immigrants as being newly arrived, and certainly you have a number of new arrivals here in the Silicon Valley. But this is the share, these are the states in the United States arrayed by how long immigrants have been there, the percent of the immigrants in the state that have been there since 1999. And you can see that California has the most settled immigrant population. About 72% of our immigrants have been in the country for longer than about 11, 12 years. In fact, about half of our undocumented immigrants have been in the country for longer than 10 years. Which is fascinating because when people think about undocumented immigrants, what they tend to think about is some person standing in front of Home Depot who just got there last week. But really what we're talking about are people who've been here for quite a long time, very settled into the economy and into society, and you'll see it in just a minute. You'll note here that the state that is actually the runner-up in terms of having the most settled immigrant population is actually Vermont. But that's because they have like 2 immigrants, and they've been there a long time, those 2 immigrants. And by the way, if you're from Vermont and you're sensitive about that joke, get over it. So the other thing to realize is that this is a diverse population, and in fact, in a report that we did, What's at Stake for the State, in the Silicon Valley, and this means in this case Santa Clara County and San Mateo County, 174,000 residents are undocumented residents. That's 8% of your workforce. And nearly 1 in 7 Silicon Valley kids have at least one parent who's undocumented. Which means that, and by the way, the vast majority of these 77% are citizens, which means that if we get comprehensive immigration reform that includes a path to legalization and a path to citizenship, we're talking major difference in the lives for a huge section, not only of people living in the Silicon Valley, but also of their children, which represents the next generation. And we need, and I'm very heartened to see that coming out of Silicon Valley leadership has been a commitment to balanced immigration reform. That is to make sure that there's a future flow of labor at the high skill end and at the low skill end, H-1B visas, but also the kind of guest worker programs, and a commitment that's emerged here too with regard to legalization and a path to citizenship for the currently unauthorized. Because the interesting secret, and it's kind of one of the reasons why the statistics are there in the first place, Emmett, is that the Silicon Valley, as much as you thrive on high skill labor, you thrive on low skill labor as well. Because behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and gardeners and food service workers. And this is consistent with what we find in Boston, what we find in Austin. Every place you've got high tech, you also have low skill labor, making sure that the conditions for that high tech work are actually there and people are able to succeed. So this is what you look like, and I want to talk a little bit now about the geography of all this nationally, and then I promise to try to go a little bit shorter and kind of get you back on schedule. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the geography, I'll talk a little bit about the economy, and then I'll come to a kind of stirring and emotional, kind of thrilling conclusion, really. So hang on. So I want to tell you a little bit about sort of where the geography of this is, because when people think about the change that's happening, in particular, given the fact that so much of it's happening in California, is they think, well, you know, it's all happening in California, right? That the reason the U.S. is going to become majority people of color in 2042 is because California is going to become 150% minority, right? There'll be sort of super minorities sort of walking the earth of California. But in fact, this change is happening all over the country. This is from bunch of work they were doing with a group called PolicyLink in Oakland. These are the counties of the United States. It's an easy map to interpret. The browner the county, the browner the county. So the darkest shade, greater than 50% people of color, middle shade, 40 to 50% people of color. In 1980, the country looked like what most people still think it's like, with the exception of California. That is, the Black Belt of the South heading up to DC, the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, Native American and Hispanic areas in Arizona and New Mexico. But look at California in 1980, pretty interesting. The only majority-minority county was Imperial County, bordering Mexico. Los Angeles had not yet crossed that threshold. By the time you get to 1990, you can see a lot of action happening in California in 2000, and then with the last census in 2010. So lots of change. And this is what's projected for the next 30 years, 2020, 2030, and 2040. So at least to me, there's two takeaways from this map. One is, if you have friends in some of those areas that were light before, and they don't have a good taqueria near them now, tell them, don't worry, one is coming. The second, if you look at that map, is that the areas of the country that are not experiencing demographic change are either lightly populated or they're the industrial Midwest, they're not thriving. And in fact, what's interesting to see is Detroit's new initiative to bring immigrants in. St. Louis is launching an initiative like this. The connection of this changing demography and their kids with actually economic vitality. What does it look like for California? This is California in 1980. California in the last census, California in 2040. One thing this map doesn't show us is that actually a lot of this population growth, and in particular 18-year-olds coming online, is going to be happening in inland California, in the Central Valley, and in the Inland Empire. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the way that this is going on geographically is that when people think about demographic change, people of color populations, they tend to think that what's going on is that this is happening in our cities. But the story is now that the places that are experiencing the most rapid demographic change and the places that are experiencing the most sharp increases in poverty are in fact America's suburbs. And this can be seen by looking at the Bay Area as a whole. This is the Bay Area in 1980 with the lighter shades being more non-Hispanic white. And you can see how much that's changed between 1980 and 2010. What's that meant for African Americans? What's interesting for African Americans is it's been a relative depopulation of the Bay Area. Many people moving out because of high housing costs, going to Stockton, Vallejo, Napa, etc. You can see what happened, for example, to East Palo Alto, parts of San Francisco, and even the East Bay. The Latino population growing rapidly all over. And for you in particular in the Silicon Valley, the Asian population growing. And let's just look back here on Fremont becoming more Latino and becoming more Asian. 20, 30 years ago, we would have thought of Fremont as a white suburb of the valley. In fact, it's become quite diverse. Now, the thing that's also gone on is that there's been significant development of pockets of poverty. So if you look at this map, you'll see that East San Jose, and I know the mayor is here, and I know that you've been doing great work trying to address these issues for years. You can see this in East San Jose. You can see it in Redwood City. Some of you may be wondering why there's this huge pocket of poverty in Palo Alto. It's those damn students. So it's like a statistical anomaly, right? They're temporarily poor. We're hoping that they'll invent something and get rich. Unless, of course, they're my son. I always like to talk about him. I really love him. I was thinking about him because this thing that was said about kids moving back into their house, my son, after he graduated he went to college and got a degree in theater. And so he pretty quickly moved back into the house. And it was about 2 months into his stay there, and I said, Joaquin, what part of empty nest do you not understand? You seem to have the nest part totally down. Anyway, he's moved on and he's got a thriving career. He is a musician whose backup career is as an actor, which means I have to give lots of speeches to get honoraria. So let me ask you a question. Were some of those kind of demographic statistics interesting to you? Okay. None of those, thank you, none of those is as interesting as this set of statistics, which has to do with the median age, half older, half younger, of the US and California populations. The median age for non-Hispanic whites in the United States is 42 years. In California, it's 45. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders is 35. For African Americans, 32. For Native Americans, 30. For Pacific Islanders, 29. The median age in the country and in California for Latinos is 27. Now, 42, 27, it's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain our demographic change. Because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. Godspeed. But it also helps to explain our politics, because we have an older generation looking at a younger generation that doesn't quite resemble them. And while you think, well, gosh, with our big and open minds, perhaps that can't really be a dynamic that's going on, think about the following thing. Two things, actually. One is, what state do you think has the biggest generation gap, the whitest old, the brownest young? Florida, good guess, wrong. California, Texas, Arizona. Think about the politics in Arizona around immigration, ethnic studies in the school, divestments in the schools, et cetera. And one of the things that we found is we've been doing work where we take a look at where the gap is the largest and then compare that to spending on kids. And you can see almost a sort of mirror image that where the gap is the largest, those are the darker colors, the spending is the lowest in terms of education spending per capita. Now, some of you, if you're looking at this map, you might think, well, gosh, that's just a map. Maybe it's suggestive. Let me just let you know that the results hold in a cross-section time series where we control for fixed effects and all the other variables that might explain the level of education spending. And we still find that the racial generation gap has a statistically significant impact on spending per student. And by the way, if you didn't understand that because you didn't take graduate student statistics, all it means is I'm right. So the gap matters, and it's something that we need to address because it's part of the reason why we're not tackling some of these growing issues of income inequality. Now, this is a chart showing you the share of income going to the top 1%, the top 1 to 5%, that's the red line, the top 5 to 10%. One of the things that you'll notice is that there's sort of two peaks for income going to the top 1%. One is 1928, the year before the Great Depression. The other was 2007, the year before the Great Recession. And I want to get to that because I want to talk a little bit about why inequity actually might not be good for the economy. But you can see that there's been a growing share of income going to the top 1%, but also a growing share of income going to those just below them. One thing that is totally muddled in the conversation about inequality is mixing those two things up. Because for the top 1%, it's mostly been shifts in tax policy, increases in CEO pay, the move to a winner-take-all economy. That's the reason why 30 years ago, on average, a CEO's pay was about 20 times that of the average worker in his firm. It was a him, a he. Now, that CEO pay is about 200 times. That's a tenfold increase in the last 30 years, hard to explain by just simply increased productivity. But the other thing I'm going to jump over this, and this has become a hot topic, including at the World Economic Forum, where inequality was identified as the #1 risk. And it's very important here in California. California used to be considered a land of opportunity, but it's now one of the most unequal states in the United States. This is a measure called the Gini coefficient, a sort of standard measure of income inequality. We are now more unequal than Georgia and Alabama, states we've always looked to as beacons of social justice and opportunity. And Russ, who now that they're developing the index in-house, certainly has the data right. One thing that is a secret about the Silicon Valley is that your Gini coefficient 30 years ago was much better than the states and much better than the countries. That is, 20, 30 years ago, opportunities were much more widespread. Now your Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, is getting worse than the countries to become a paradigm for moving forward in a way that's a bit more unequal. And part of that is changing returns to education, one of the reasons why it's so important to address the issues Emmett said. And sorry if I'm jumping over these a little too quickly. I'm trying to catch us up a little bit on time. But don't worry, there's no quiz afterwards. But they'll be posted for you to take a look at. So there's also tremendous sort of inequality by race. You saw it in the statistics that were presented by Russell and by Emmett a little bit earlier. But here we can take a look at the percent of families living below the poverty line in California. You can see huge gaps between the experience of non-Hispanic whites and African Americans and Latinos in particular. One thing people don't pay attention to, the poverty rates for Asian Pacific Islanders are actually pretty high. That's because the Asian economic experience is a bifurcated experience, some very high wage earners, but also folks who are living under conditions of poverty. In Santa Clara County, the overall poverty rates are lower, congratulations, but the disparities are just as bad in terms of the experience for African Americans, a small population here, the experience for Latinos. So I'm going to jump over this to talk about the fact that the reasons why we should do something about this have not just to do with do-gooderism or sort of liberal sentiments or moral values, although I hope you have some moral values. Those are good things. But they have to do with the fact that increasingly what research is telling us is that while the old conventional wisdom, what we used to teach in economics classes, was that somehow inequality was good for economic health, turns out that it's not. There's been a series of cross-country studies done by a number of economists over the years taking a look at those countries that are more equitable in terms of their opportunities and income structures and finding out that they actually sustain more growth over time. The most important of these studies was done just last year by the International Monetary Fund, looking at the fact that those countries that are more unequal tend to have shorter growth spells, less sustainable economic growth. Now I know what you might, and we've been looking at this in America's metropolitan regions, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I know what you might be thinking. You might be saying, I don't know about that. I mean, that guy, like now he's a professor at USC, and we're from Stanford, and we don't like that. And before he was a professor at UC Santa Cruz, I mean, that's a place that doesn't even have grades, right? And like their mascot is the banana slug, right? Or as I like to think of it, the fighting banana slug, right? And so I don't know how we can believe him. So, don't believe me, really, don't believe me. Believe that well-known left-leaning institution, the Cleveland Federal Reserve, which for the metropolitan region of Cleveland decided to take a look at what predicts regional prosperity, and what they found out was much to their surprise. They found out some things that we all know matter, the quality of the workforce in terms of education, whether or not you have anchor institutions, whether or not you've got a diversified industrial structure. But what they found out to their surprise was that 3 factors predicted economic growth in an important way. Whether or not there was a lot of income inequality, it slowed down growth. Whether or not there was a lot of residential segregation and therefore social distance between people, slowed down growth. Whether or not there were a lot of city-suburb splits. So we've been looking at that as well. We've been looking at that, mimicking the International Monetary Fund studies, looking at sustained growth in America's metropolitan regions. And we have also found out that where you've got a lot of inequality, you actually have shorter growth spells. You've got more volatile growth. And actually, it's not even as though it's volatile and sort of rapid and does well. For a while, it actually does not lead to growth in the long run. Most of that, by the way, is in this book we put out last year. My understanding is that Russ is buying copies for everybody here. The book is called Just Growth. It's just really a great book. It's an easy read. For those of you who are not readers, you don't need to worry. It's about to be made into a major motion picture. Actually, I have to rush right after this. I'm going down to negotiate the last part of the movie rights. I was going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. Turns out it's George Lopez, but I'm still excited. So what we found out in this book is the thing that I mentioned. But what's key about this is that addressing these issues of inequality is important because when we underinvest in each other, it makes us less competitive as a nation. And when we have tremendous inequality, it creates social tensions about who will win and who will lose, and it makes it difficult for us to agree on what growth strategies will be moving forward. So this is really, I hope, a challenging set of kind of messages for all of us. For those of you who've been mostly involved in the economic growth and business side of things, it's an appeal to think about the issues of opportunity and income inequality in terms of the business case. For those of you who've been more on the social service side of things or the equity side of things, it's an appeal for you to think about where are the sweet spots where dealing with issues of inequity actually also produce economic growth. They are around things like the Earned Income Tax Credit. They are around things like making sure that the public transit system gets people to work. They are around things like the minimum wage, so we can lift people up and make sure that they get forward. They are around things like comprehensive immigration reform, which will bring people out of the shadows, bring in new supplies of labor, and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, predicts will shave $1 trillion off of our federal deficit over the next 20 years. So for those of us on the equity side of things, we need to be thinking about those policies which hit this sweet spot, the just growth sweet spot, where growth and equity come together. So what does this mean for you all moving forward? I'm going to conclude with just a few thoughts. The first is to understand this generation coming up. And I think the thing that's really important is that when people see, I think it's like happens on the right and the left. On the right, people go, oh my God, there's all these minorities coming forward and they're going to be angry. They're going to try to take stuff away. And then people on the left are like, oh wow, this is really exciting. There's going to be a lot of minorities and they'll be angry and they'll try to take stuff away. If you work with these young people, if you have contact with these young people, what you realize is they're not angry, they're aspirational. They have every reason to be angry because of the underinvestment that's going on in schools, because of the over-incarceration of young men of color, because of the fact that their parents remain excluded, often, from an immigration system that's broken. They have every reason to be angry, but they're aspirational. We need to appeal to their best. The second, for all of you, is to stress, again, that equity and inclusion are fundamental, not add-ons. And in doing that, to think about the ways, and you'll hear about them today, that you can blend innovation with inclusion, like the Khan Academy. How can you blend high tech with high need? But most of all, needing to think a little bit about a different kind of leadership, and that's where I will end. When I taught at UC Santa Cruz, we used to run something called Summer Institute Social Change Across Borders, which brought people from communities in Latin America and Latino communities together to talk about transnational ties and leadership and change. And in the middle of one of those meetings, there was an organizer named Victor Quintana from Sinaloa, Mexico, who said, there's only two kind of leaders in this world. Leaders who like the game of chess and leaders who like the jigsaw puzzle. And like you, we were looking at him going, what the hell does that mean? And what Victor said was, well, you know, in chess, there's only two colors, usually black and white. And in the jigsaw puzzle, there are many different colors. And indeed, a single piece can be multi-hued. In chess, some pieces are far more powerful than others. You are really bummed out when you lose your queen, particularly to a pawn. In the jigsaw puzzle, every piece is important because you know that sense of frustration when you get to the end and one or two are missing? And you know it's your kids, right? In chess, the object, the way you move forward is literally by knocking somebody down, right? And taking over their territory. In the jigsaw puzzle, the way you make progress is by fitting the pieces together so seamlessly that you don't know where one ends and another begins. In chess, the object is to win. In the jigsaw puzzle, the object is to complete the tapestry. We, as a nation, have been playing way too much chess and not enough jigsaw puzzle. In terms of our politics, in terms of our polarization, in terms of our seeing the next generation as different than this generation, in terms of seeing immigrants as the permanent other rather than a thriving part of our economy, the Silicon Valley has always thrived on both celebrating individuals and competition and individual achievement, but always realizing that it's part of an ecosystem of thriving clusters, of thriving people who together put together a seamless valley, one where people can realize their dreams. So my admonition to you, yeah, play some chess, but make sure you're playing some jigsaw puzzle too. Thank you.